Okay, welcome everyone to our book talk event. Today we are joined by Charmian Mansell to discuss her latest work, Female Servants in Early Modern England. And then we will also be joined in discussion by Julie Hardwick and Steve Hindle. I will begin just by briefly introducing our speakers, and then I will turn it over to them to get started. So, Charmian Mansell is British Academy Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the University of Cambridge. She is currently on research fellowships until December at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., and the Huntington Library in L.A. She is the author of Female Servants in Early Modern England, which is out now, and what we will be discussing today. You guys also, for registering, should have received an email with the discount code for the book and information about how to purchase as well. And so we'll also be joined by Julie Hardwick, who is the John E. Green Professor of History at the University of Texas in Austin. Her most recent book, Sex in an Old Regime City, Young People, Intimacy, and Work in France, 1660 to 1789, was published with Oxford University Press in 2020. And we'll also be joined by Steve Hindle, who is Derek Hurst Professor of History at Washington University in St. Louis, and the author most recently of The Social Topography of a Rural Community, published with OUP in 2023. So I hope you all join me in welcoming that, and I will turn it on over to you guys to get started.
Thank you. Thank you, for everyone for coming. And yeah, thank you, Amanda, for so generously chairing, for Julie and Steve, both for agreeing to be here to read the book and offer their reflections. I'm just going to start by kind of very briefly reflecting a little bit myself on the book, really on the kind of process of writing the book, and giving a very, very brief outline for those who haven't read it yet, to tell you what it's all about. So I guess the book kind of first started life really back in 2009, 2010, when I wrote my master's dissertation on female servants. Quite a long time ago. I've been thinking about servants for quite a long time now. Quite how I sort of came to be interested in female servants is this question that people often ask. I'm not entirely sure where it really came from. My nan had a very brief stint in service. She used to tell me really terrible kind of horror stories about service. So maybe it came from there. I think mostly I was just really quite curious about histories of people we don't really know so much about. And female servants very much kind of, I guess, fit that bill. So for the early modern period, we have obviously very few sources that offer direct evidence of the lived experiences of servants. Literacy rates of women, especially working women, were very low in the period 1530 to 1650, which is the period that my book covers. So we have no servant diaries, we have no kind of autobiographical works that we can kind of draw on. We're left maybe with financial or statistical records, so possibly household accounts or kind of settlement examinations maybe, in which servants might feature, or letters or diaries that might be penned by only literate employers. But these give kind of very, I suppose, particular perspectives on servants, and not ones in which servants are kind of at the heart, I suppose. So I've become really quite inspired, I guess, by the work of people like Laura Gowing, Bernard Capp, obviously Natalie Zeman Davis, all using court records as a window onto the lives of those who leave fewer traces in the archives. And so this kind of work led me to thinking about how servant experiences might turn up in those records, how they might be recorded and represented in court witness testimony in particular. So and particularly the church courts, which form the basis of this study. What I'd read about female servants in this period tended, I think, to focus on the very vulnerable position that service placed women in, and the kind of master-servant relationship loomed quite large in this. So I found myself quite sort of troubled, not only by that as an idea, but also by the idea that this was what service looked like in this period for all women. And I found myself wanting to know more about what it was like to actually be a servant. So everything about their experiences, from what work they did, how they found work, how often they maybe changed jobs, where they slept, who they knew. And it struck me that there was a kind of richer, maybe more kind of textured history of female service to be written. So this was the project I sort of embarked upon in 2013, when I started my PhD at the University of Exeter under the supervision of Professor Jane Whittle, to whom I owe an enormous amount. So I began immersing myself in the archives, working through thousands of church court depositions from across sort of the southwestish of England. So the sort of geographical area that I was working on for my thesis grew as I started turning this into a book. But basically, the book covers dioceses that are coterminous with today's counties of Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, Hampshire, Gloucestershire, Herefordshire, and some parts of Shropshire. And I think that's everywhere. For those who aren't familiar with church courts, I could talk for ages about them, but they effectively had a whole range of functions. They pursued their own suits against sort of delinquent parishioners, as well as regulating clergymen. They also arbitrated in kind of inter-party disputes between parishioners. Their remit was broadly to maintain sort of parochial harmony. So they might pursue suits against people who'd committed adultery, sex outside marriage, those who hadn't attended church, or clergymen with deviant practices. But they also arbitrated in these inter-party disputes, so disputes between particular parishioners. And 4 types of disputes come up most regularly. That's tithe disputes, so disputes over the income being derived from tithes. Matrimonial suits, these are usually betrothals, people that basically promised to marry somebody and then didn't marry them, so you could kind of haul them to court. Testamentary disputes, these are disputes over effectively wills, and defamation suits. If the act of bringing that suit to court didn't just basically kind of settle the case, then witnesses were called upon to testify. So they give evidence of what they knew. And witnesses testified in all of these cases that I've talked about. So they might say that they'd overheard insults, for example, that have been slung over garden hedges, and then they'd be kind of called upon to testify in a defamation suit. So the book picks out from effectively thousands of depositions that I was working through, female servants who appear as plaintiffs in these suits, defendants, most commonly witnesses, and those mentioned contextually by basically other witnesses. From the archives, I managed to pull out just over 1,000 female servants. Sometimes we have literally their name, and we catch just like the tiniest of glimpses of them. But sometimes we have much more kind of substantial information about their lives. The book also brings to the fore sort of the entire surviving corpus of church court depositions from the counties that I've mentioned across the period 1530 to 1650. So I wanted to understand the context in which the servants that I'd identified actually appeared. So my data set effectively comprises information about nearly 28,000 witnesses in all. So, as I said, 1,000 female servants, 28,000 witnesses. Finding these servants within this huge corpus was, quite honestly, needle in a haystack work. It took forever. And in the end, they make up kind of less than about 2% of all the witnesses. Their gender and their age made them less than suitable. They were seen as potentially not as reliable. But they do appear as witnesses because they were trusted. They were there witnessing things, and they were deeply embedded in the everyday structures and communities of early modern society. I should also point out here that they came from sort of quite a variety of backgrounds, and they served in homes both of rich and sort of fairly modest homes too. The book is less interested in the cases in which servants appear, although the legal kind of pretext for their appearance in the records does feature in the book. And of course, it's the reason that the documents exist in the first place, so we can't ignore it. But I'm more interested in what the records can tell us about experiences of service. And some of this evidence arises more or less incidentally. I mean, I could talk more about the kind of reliability of these sources, but I'm aware of time. I'm interested in the servant who, incidentally recalls that she was reaping in the fields, for example, when she overhears her neighbour or neighbours calling each other names. The book takes both quantitative and qualitative approaches to this evidence. So from these witness statements, I've managed to capture things like servant ages, which has allowed me to reconstruct the age structure of service. We find servants from as young as 7 to as old as 60, quantify the work that servants did, so just around 25% of which was housework, analyze the spaces that we find servants in. So only about 50% of the time, servants are actually within their masters' homes. But I also find evidence that can't easily be quantified. So, for example, signatures, servant signatures, they all sign their depositions with some sort of mark. So you have servants leaving a perfect star, or leaving a sign that's indicative of a particular trade. All of these things I've looked at much more kind of qualitatively, I suppose. For those, I mean, I won't say too much more about I guess the kind of substantial findings of the book. I'll leave Julie and Steve to maybe unpick that a little bit more. For those looking maybe to what else the book can tell us about beyond servants, it intersects with, it's got 9 chapters that intersect with material on work, on authority, community, memory, mobility, migration, law, regulation. Yeah, so there's so much more I could say here. So maybe that's enough sort of spoilers from me. I'll let you kind of go away and and read it yourselves. But yeah, I'm really excited to hear what Julie and Steve have thought of the book. And so I should say I'll pass it over to Julie first.
All right. I accept the baton from you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. I'm really delighted and honored to be part of this conversation about Charmian's wonderful book. And let me just say, I'm the outsider here in some ways. That is that Charmian and I, in many ways, have the same research wheelhouse. That is ordinary people, women and gender, sexuality, lived experience, households, work, law, the economy, patriarchy. I think we're both light on religion. At least people often tell me that, Charmian, and I thought that when I was reading. I didn't think you were light, of course, because that's what I do, but I didn't notice that. We share that too. And we're both working intensively with legal materials, especially with court records. In other ways, we're situated very differently. I'm primarily an urban historian. And above all, although I read very extensively in the early modern British material, research-wise, I'm wholly a historian of France and the global French Empire. So let me say that first of all. I want to make a quick observation on format first, that Charmian very nicely arranged for Steve and I to have hard copies of this, which didn't reach us in time. So we read the PDF. And I hate reading books like that. So my attitude was really cranky when I started. But actually, I think here the format works great. As Steve said when we were talking before, it's searchable, of course. But also here, Charmian has hyperlinked, to different sections of the book that she's talking about in a way that I found very helpful. And it's the first time I've had a good read of a book in this format, I think. So. So let me just say, I love this book. And the evidence is wonderfully rich here. I'm in love with the evidence that you have. It reflects a tremendous amount of hard work on your part, as well as very careful and creative thinking about method, about how we can use, as you said, in some ways, this very fragmentary. We always see a fragment in court records, and I think you said only 2% of your records even involved the witnesses here. And I think you absolutely succeeded in what you said at the start with your project, that is to give us a much more nuanced picture of female servants, and one with very important contributions, I think, to a wide range of fields. The archival work here is absolutely terrific, I think, and I noticed among other places on page 61, when you were talking about your method, you have a really lovely example of how you stretched out. That's how you describe what you thought of your project or your method as. Stretched out Anne Nash's life by linking a church court deposition to many other records. And, of course, record linkage is a well-established method for us. But it's such hard work, and it's so beautifully done here. And it's based on a lot of persistence and archival stamina. I often think stamina is just a hugely underrated factor about what's important for a historian, and I'm impressed with your epic stamina. I think this strategy of placing servant stories in these longer biographies, of stretching out like that, is a really important innovation in this project. And you get so much intellectual payoff where you persuasively demonstrate the sort of multifaceted lives female servants had, and the multifaceted roles they had in their communities as well as their households. And I was really struck by that part, placing them in community as well as the household. Other things I was especially struck by, partly because they coincide with what I'm interested in, was decentering sexual assaults as a defining issue for servants, which is not to minimize the frequency of sexual assault or the seriousness. And I've been writing a lot about sexual violence myself, but I would say that our historiography on that, as you say, in France and I think other continental European places, is that servants are just the most visible in those records for a variety of reasons. It doesn't mean that that was the defining experience for servants or that they were more, I think, likely to be subjects of sexual assault. So I really think that's very important. And although this book focuses on single women working as servants, so let's say gender and labor history, I think there were really important contributions to legal history and economic history here. And I was amused to notice, Steve, that you and I were cited in the same paragraph on one legal history issue at one point. But I really want to encourage you, Charmian, to publish some of this legal history stuff separately, like in a legal history journal like Law and History Review, because I think it would be tremendously interesting to a wide range of legal historians. So I want to start us off with just a couple of observations or reflection really, and a couple of questions, although I think each question has two parts. And I can come around again to more questions later if we have time, but I think our audience will also have a lot of questions. So first, more of a reflection on French history that I was reminded again here, as I have been in Steve's work and other people working on early modern England, that this so much superb work rests on a research base we don't have in France, and that's church court records. Our ecclesiastical court records are almost entirely lost from the early modern period, from pre-1800. Some of you might know in a couple of places, Nîmes and Geneva, church records survive, but they're actually Calvinist consistory court records, very different kind of a project. We've also got this thing going in our historiography. Well, it doesn't matter because ecclesiastical courts became much less important in the early modern period and secular courts became much more important. And, it's hard to argue for an absence there. But I am struck again by that. And I wonder what, in fact, the impact of that is, of that absence on our scholarship on French communities. And I don't have an answer to that, but I chew on it. I've selected two big issues in this book to ask you a couple of questions about. I mean, I could have asked you 100 questions. One is about how you talk about and argue about agency in the lives of these female servants here, which you raise as a key theme on page 14, and you come back to it many times subsequently. And it's the central dynamic of this book, or a central dynamic of this book in many ways. So I thought about that in two ways, or I think about that in two ways. One is about the question of patriarchy. You say on that same page, which is 14, that women breach prescriptive codes and rules of behavior demanded of them in literature and in legislation. Honestly, I think most gender historians have moved away from thinking there was any tight relationship between patriarchal prescription and lived experience. And you provide here such a rich and nuanced analysis with very compelling evidence about the ways in which status and power was constantly reconfigured in lived experience, partly through your attentiveness in a wonderfully suggestive way to how the lives of servants outside of households mediated so much of what was going on. And because our vision has tended to be, much more on the household itself, I think this is really a superb dimension and a really important aspect of the book. I do like Alison Posker's framing in a 2018 forum about patriarchy and gender in history that a lot of you might know, about rethinking patriarchy. Susan Amerson, Alex Shepard, Mary Wiesner, all the usual suspects also took part in that, as well as Bianca Primo, bringing Latin American view. And Alison made an argument there about agentic norms, that what we see in communities is that communities develop for women these agentic norms where they expected women to take on all kinds of tasks and roles on the community, and that those sort of rested alongside patriarchal prescription, let's say. And so that it wasn't the case that women were breaching or resisting patriarchal prescription, because the community already also had these agentic norms about what women should be doing and needed to do, really, for the community to function, as you say. So I have a question about what you might think about that as a way to think about that. And the second is the girl power argument, which you circle back to repeatedly, although mostly in fleeting references. And, this has been the subject of such intense criticism. Some people hate it. See Sheila Ogilvy, for instance. I actually will say that I had some of that work in for review, and I thought it was highly underdeveloped. But I am drawn to it in a certain way, as I think you are. In terms of helping us center our attention on women's centrality to economic change. That is, I kind of regret that they pushed it out so early, and then it just attracted this firestorm of criticism. And sometimes I feel like that boat's gone down under the firestorm. But I'd like you to talk a bit more fully, or perhaps less fragmentedly than you do here, about where you see your work fitting with or advancing that argument. Can we sort of rescue that in some useful way? I think you end up saying here, as you do on page 99, that being good for economic growth doesn't mean it was individually empowering. And I think that's a key slippage with their argument. And so you're correcting already that, I think, by making that distinction. But I'd like to hear you talk a bit more about that. Secondly, because I'm nearly out of time, you have so many new insights and observations about servants here, by thinking about them with this wider lens as multidimensional people, and as this is only a part of their life course. And I was especially struck by your innovative discussion about their memories of being servants and their anxiety about the future. One of my colleagues, Neil Camel, is working on future orientation among Huguenot artisans at the moment, and I'm really interested in that. And this led you to talk about them having an important role as repositories of knowledge for their communities. And we're so interested in these questions about artisanal and household production of knowledge now, this sort of grassroots production of knowledge. I was interested if you could talk in that a bit more broadly than kind of history, if you know what I mean, local knowledge about the past. And also, finally, I had a question about, you do such a great job with elite servants and ordinary servants here, and that's very uncommon to do them together. But I wondered if you could speculate at all about the emergence of a small but distinctive group of young Black servants, of enslaved servants in this time period in elite and merchant households. I know that's outside your bailiwick. They were mostly boys, that other kinds of things. But I wondered if you could fit that in. Anyway, it was a treat for me. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Julie. I guess, Steve, do you want to kind of offer your comments, and then I'll come back to the questions? Does that make sense?
If that suits you. Thanks very much, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Charmian, for the invitation to comment on this awe-inspiring book. I'm full of admiration for the archival rigor, the stamina, the heroism, as it were, the conceptual sophistication, and the narrative drive with which this argument is sustained. I think we've already heard about the needles and the haystacks, but it's worth emphasizing 28,000 witnesses, 16,000 litigants, 117 years worth of court records, 5 dioceses, 17 counties. This is really remarkable archival enterprise. But it's all built into an argument that I think is powerful and will be influential for a long time to come. The servants in question here proved to be a surprisingly elusive quarry. As the transparent methodological introduction explains, servants are much harder to identify in the historical record than you might think. But when Charmian tracks them down, their life experiences prove to be invaluable for our understanding of how the early modern economy, both within and especially beyond the household, depended on the efforts and expertise of subordinated female labour. There are 1,093 female servants discussed, analysed, and animated in this remarkable book, and never has this important but neglected group been subjected to such forensic scrutiny. The conclusions of the study are profound. Service turns out to be, on this reading, a much more expansive category than we could possibly have imagined. Virtually all our assumptions about this group are challenged. It was not exclusively domestic, it was not fleeting, and it was not transitory. It was not confined to a specific age group or to a particular stage in the life cycle. The only thing that the word servant signified, Charmian insists, was a labour relationship. Quoting her here, doing something on another person's behalf. This is the only truth that holds for every single servant discussed in this book. There was, she suggests, an almost complete lack of conceptual distinction between wage labour on the one hand and service on the other. Charmian pushes hard, I think, at the implications of these findings. Julie's already mentioned girl power, but I'm going to weigh in on that controversial argument here just briefly. She calls into question the most recent macroeconomic, and she suggests a highly optimistic reading of the relationship between life cycle service, the European marriage pattern, and the growth of capitalism. The girls and women discussed here were not generally empowered, and few of them exercised any real agency in the contracts to which they were subject. The world of choice, freedom, and enhanced opportunities for human capital formation depicted in De Moore and Van Zanden's book seems very remote from the southwestern counties of 16th and 17th century England. The argument also has implications for our understanding of the authority of the early modern English state to regulate service contracts in particular and labour relations in general. As Charmian shows, the legislative framework was certainly there, established in the 14th century and enhanced in the mid-16th, but there seems to have been little appetite for local regulation. And in any case, one of her most important findings, so many of the covenants that govern service relationships were verbal and so flexible as to be not worth the paper that they were not written on. I could wax lyrical about the specific findings of the book. We could have whole seminars on Charmian's reading of the material and sentimental value of servants' clothing, for instance, or of servants' ability to recall the circumstances of their employment long after they had departed. And an issue to which Julie has referred, the appalling episodes of sexual coercion to which these women were vulnerable and which they feared. I was particularly struck by the number of witnesses who deposed that they were not willing to carry out specific tasks or to run particular errands alone in light of the sexual harassment and assault to which they feared they might be subject. But just a word about chapter 6. If you only have time to read one chapter of this book, make sure it's the astonishing section on working lives, where the rhythms of female labour are reconstructed in rich detail. Charmian's analysis of the working experiences and economic expertise of two Basingstoke milkmaids in 1635 is in and of itself, I think, worth the price of admission. So I'd like to conclude with some questions, and I'll put them on the table very succinctly, giving Charmian the opportunity to pick them up as she wishes. So in what we might be thought of as ascending order of significance, I want to start with narrative strategy. So each of the chapters, intriguingly, begins with a modern summary, italicized in the printed version of an extract from a particular church court deposition. I was reminded of John Demos's famous and controversial strategy of italicizing those sections of the narrative in The Unredeemed Captive, which were freighted less with empirical evidence than with informed speculation. And I'd be interested to hear Charmian reflect on how she conceived of these, what are they exactly, synthetic epigraphs, and what work she hoped that they might do in her analysis. Secondly, regional geography. Is there anything sufficiently distinctive about the economy of the Southwest to suggest that her picture of service would look different had she worked through the church courts of the Midlands, for instance, or of East Anglia, or of the North? And what about chronology, thirdly? Charmian concludes by noting that, quote, a deposition-based study of service experiences in the period after the mid-17th century would be beneficial. Leaving aside the question of the diminution in the authority of the church courts after 1660 and the relative scarcity of depositional evidence in that period, what might, do we think, such a study reveal, especially in an economic context of labour shortage and rising wages? Charmian has offered us a portrait of service in what she specifically refers to as Tawney's century, but circumstances were surely very different when demographic pressure slackened. So is this picture of female service in early modern England a particular subset of the 16th, 17th and early 18th century experience? Finally, to return to girl power. If the early modern experience of female service does not fit the girl power model, what might we put in its place? Charmian is transparent, as Julie has already suggested, about a micro-exemplary methodology, and she's at pains to emphasize the contingent and constrained nature of the experience of female labour. But how might we integrate her reading of service into a broader model of economic change? Is female service simply one aspect of women's work as it is currently being reconceptualized by Jane Whittle, Alex Shepard and others in studies of the whole economy? Or did it contribute something distinctive to the pattern of social and economic change in this period? Anyway, I'll leave it at that. My goodness, what a remarkable achievement this book is. Many congratulations.
Thanks so much, Steve. And Julie, for both of your comments. Charmian, if you'd like to take a minute to respond to some of those, and then after that, we'll open it up to Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much both for your reflections. And there's a lot to think about here and to reflect on. So I'll try my best to answer the questions that I can now. I'm sure there'll be some that I'll have to go away and have a bit more thought about. But yeah, I think maybe I'll start with what what feels like the hardest one first, maybe, which you both kind of asked in various ways, which is the this kind of issue of girl power and where, you know, what can we do with this argument and this kind of theory that I think, as you said, Julie, has been always seen as kind of, I think, less than satisfactory as an explanation for economic transformation. So I guess, you know, for people that haven't read the book, you know, my book effectively shows that there is a huge variety of servant experience in this period, or for women at least. For some women, there is opportunity within service. They do negotiate higher wages. They do negotiate their contracts. They do seem to be able to, you know, leave when they want to, leave sometimes before the official contract end date. But for lots of other women, particularly when I point out the kind of children that we find in service, who, you know, it's to me quite clear that these are probably pauper apprentices who have had basically no choice. They have been placed into the homes of other families, and they stay there without a wage, and they just receive bed and board until they turn 21. To me, there is no freedom. There is no other kind of opportunity here. It's, you know, you stay here until you're 21, and even then you kind of wonder to what extent are they actually able to really kind of move on or leave. So I guess I kind of present service as not being great for women in lots of cases, not all cases, but in lots of cases. But I also think that maybe I show that that the early modern economy was quite dynamic, because it did allow for all of this sort of flexibility. So where there's a sort of a lack of security for workers and for women in these roles, perhaps that flexibility actually does allow for kind of economic growth. It does allow for for later kind of processes of industrialization. So that's you know, my kind of initial reaction maybe to thinking about that. I'd have to give that more thought, and I think it's maybe it kind of answers, well, not answers, but links to the question that you asked, Steve, about what would a picture of service in the next you know, the next 100 years where my book ends, what would that look like? I think maybe that would also help. A picture might be constructed of, you know, that would lend itself to thinking more about that change of economic change. To go back to where was it? Yeah. Julie, your comment about patriarchy and agency. I really should have read the agentic norms material you talked about, and I haven't, so I'm ashamed to say that I haven't. But
it's too much for anybody to read.
We can't read it all. Sense in relation. No, but I will now. Now you've told me. But yeah, it makes a lot of sense in relation to you know, to what I find in the book, which, you know, I do feel that in certain cases, women do seem to have what we think of as agency, although, as I say, you know, is this actually agency, or is this, that's just accepted norms? So I think that model, you know, absolutely makes sense. I think, I mean, it's a question I've been asked before, which is about kind of, you know, does patriarchy still hold? Can we still really think that this is a you know, a useful model, I suppose, for understanding particularly that kind of vision, that household patriarchy as well for servants? And I think what you say about, you know, the servants that are outside the home all of the time, they're doing work outside the home, how can we actually see that? You know, how does it work if they're not actually under the kind of surveillance or supervision of a master or mistress all the time? And I think that, you know, for me, it's not to say it's not there. It just can't operate in the kind of very restrictive way in which, you know, as you say, historians a long time ago probably assumed. The question of the narrative strategy at the very beginning of the chapters that you mentioned, Steve. Yeah, I like the synthetic epigraphs as a kind of way of describing these. I think for me, because this evidence is so fragmentary, and it is often about trying to weave a story. I mean, that's what I guess we always do in history. We're always weaving a story of some sort, but from these very fragmentary pieces of evidence, I wanted the reader to understand that is the process that is happening, and that, I mean, also that, I mean, it's in italics because it's not been lifted directly from the source. I have put a kind of narrative spin on it in some way. I think also maybe there's something, I mean, I talk about this in the book, about taking this as evidence of the plausible, that we can never really know from court depositions. We can never really know if something actually happened. But what we can say is that it was plausible because it appears in these legal records, and it was, you know, evidence going before a judge. So that kind of plausibility thing, I think I was trying to sort of play with that a little bit and think about, you know, how do I communicate to an audience or a reader that this isn't exactly what happened, maybe, but it's something that's a kind of plausible version of it. What else have I missed? Maybe regional geography. What would a focus on a different area look like? I mean, I'll speak to, I guess, East Anglia because there's been so much work done on it. I think, so one of the things I'm actually kind of interested in, it's something I sort of wish I'd had time to do with the book, but, you know, I didn't, is thinking about the regulation of service. A lot of work's been done on East Anglia, and thinking about the labour laws and how the labour laws there are supposed to have been much more rigorously enforced. So people who were not in service, or who left service before their contract had ended, supposedly the story goes that they were much more, that they would have been picked up and forced back into service. That scholarship has largely been based on looking at kind of quarter sessions records or petty sessions, which has not been the focus of my work at all. Instead, my work has been looking at legal records, but legal records that have nothing to do with that process. So what you end up with is, I guess, finding evidence of people living outside the labour laws, even though that's completely incidental. It's not being recorded for any reason. It just kind of comes up. So I would be very interested to know whether a similar study of, say, looking at the church courts for somewhere like Norfolk or something like that, whether or not that would whether we'd find something similar, whether it's the nature of the sources that suggests enforcement, I guess. So I'm not sure what I would find, but I'd be interested to find out, I suppose, is the answer to that question. I think that's all the questions. Well, I think I've answered all the questions, but please tell me if I haven't.
No, I think this would be a good opportunity anyway to open it up for a Q&A to see if the audience has any questions. So Julie, I noticed you already dropped, someone had asked you to drop the sources for the text that you had talked about. So thank you for putting that in the chat. And then I will say anyone who would like to ask a question can do so in the chat, or if you would prefer, you can raise your Zoom hand just to keep it going in a sort of orderly manner. But I will go ahead and also read the questions as they come in for the chat, just for the recording. So I'll get started. We have a question that perhaps I've misconstrued this, but is the idea that there is an association in some regions between servants and the industrious household that servants permitted this intensification? There is an association in some regions between servants and the industrious household that servants permitted this intensification. Do you need more clarification, or?
Maybe. I think, it's not something that my book's arguing for. So I don't know whether, Dave, maybe there's something else you can add to what's made you think that, but maybe I've misread what you mean. Oh, okay. Well.
I was wondering about that in relation to Steve's question, actually, in the sense that in Lyon, for instance, like female textile workers, this is such a different environment, right? But the silk industry became this huge industry in Lyon from about 1660, and that female silk workers were often referred to both as the French term for whatever task it was they were doing, winding or whatever, and as servant, like in the same text, employers, that is, people would use that same language. And Alex somewhere Alex Shepard has, maybe I just heard her say this, I'm not sure, that a servant was somebody who just did the work of the household. It doesn't imply a specific kind of labor, but the work associated with the household. So I was also wondering, similarly, maybe to Dave here, in response to what Steve was saying, that it's a kind of a flexibility in female labor as servants that might allow households to specialize, to increase production in some kinds of goods. Do you know what I mean? Because what, as you show so beautifully, there was never a kind of rigid pattern of what they were going to do. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think that makes sense. Sorry, Steve, did you want to comment on that?
I was just going to say that's one of the reasons why a study of the later period would prove so interesting, I think, especially if you're looking at rural communities where industrial development was taking place, be it in textiles or metalwork, and what the implications of the presence of female servants in those households was for labour productivity. The big debate over social reproduction that's starting to characterize so much of the literature on women's work, the ways in which the work that makes the work possible proves critical to broader economic development. I think that might be a helpful lens, but I suspect that most of the evidence for that would be for the later period, or the later 17th century, especially for certain parts of the country.
Yeah. I mean, I guess thinking about that term servant, I mean, I do say this in the book that actually what it means proves to be quite slippery, even here, even in this period. And I think you know, the kind of the nature of the contracts that word is underpinning is really quite varied. So you have people that are working very casually, being called servants, people who are literally employed for like a week sometimes, being called a servant, but then also people that are, you know, the much more kind of traditional version of a servant we'd expect, an annually paid, annually contracted servant also being called a servant. So I guess thinking about what you just said, Julie, about, you know, the you know, particularly about specialization and about, you know, whether I would be interested to know whether in that later period as well, whether that language does become more kind of consolidate, like that servant has a much more specific meaning. But I suspect it wouldn't, and I suspect, particularly not for women, I suspect that it wouldn't. I suspect it would be, as you've described, you know, people doing quite specialist tasks. And I mean, I guess maybe there's even some evidence of it in my book. I mean, Steve, you mentioned chapter 6 and some of the kind of knowledge that servants had about particular processes. So, you know, one of the servants in that chapter, she doesn't describe actually being involved in it, but she talks about about beekeeping and making honey. And she has all this knowledge about how what that process looks like, and what's good honey, what's bad honey, how much it sells for. But
there's a lovely phrase that you use, that even where they feigned ignorance, they were expected to know. And I thought that was such a telling reading of the evidence, a really persuasive reading of the evidence.
Yeah, they feign ignorance because they're being asked about it in relation to basically, in order to make their case, the plaintiff or the defense to make their case, they need to be able to show that this person would know how much the price of the honey is, and so they pretend they don't know. I don't know, but really they do. They quite obviously know a lot about the processes of making honey, or in the other cases, it's about the price of milk and how many cows would produce so much milk and things. Yeah. But yeah, so I do wonder whether there is, I mean, I think, again, it's where this kind of catch-all term servant, it just covers so much more than I think we have kind of maybe realized. And I think it also means different things in different contexts. And maybe that does come back to Dave's question as well about, you know, whether or not, yeah, about kind of particular households adopting it in different ways, and it being potentially much more specialized, and could lead to this kind of industrious household. It's not something I really particularly address in the book, but I think that, yeah, it could be conceived of in that way, maybe.
All right, thanks. We had another question from David, different David. He says, terrific, congratulations. Can you trace any long-term or post-service connections or relationships with employing families or households, perhaps recognition and rewards in wills?
Yeah, yeah, thank you. So there's a couple that are bringing to mind. One is I think it's chapter 2, I think, Tracing Lives. And it is a servant called Anne Nash. So she emerges in a deposition from 1630, which is a matrimonial dispute. So it's basically her fellow servant claims that she has been betrothed to this man called Thomas Whittingham, and Anne Nash basically comes to the church court and deposes on her behalf and says, yes, they were definitely betrothed. I was there when it happened. It's very interesting because it all happens one, I can't remember, it's like a particular festival or festival day, and they're all clearly drunk, and clearly this betrothal has happened under the influence of drink. So some of them deny that the guy was drunk when he promised to marry her. Other people say, yeah, so he was. But Anne Nash comes up as a witness, and interestingly, I looked, so it tells me that her employer was an alderman, a Gloucester alderman named John Jones, and he's very, very prominent because he's a member of the sort of civic elite. He's also very involved with the church court. He he literally has a monument that I then later found inside Gloucester Cathedral that he had erected. So I found, actually material kind of evidence of her employer, not of Anne. But he also leaves a will. So he dies a year after Anne deposes in the church court. And interestingly, he says that so long as she's still in his service, when he dies, she's to receive the highest legacy of all of his servants. And it turns out she's actually, from the deposition, she tells us that she's actually been with him for 12 years. So I managed to kind of work back, and it turns out she would have been, I think something like about 10, 11 when she would have gone into his service, which is very young. So possibly one of these kind of pauper apprentices. I also have where she's born, which is Brockworth, just outside Gloucester. And I managed to find her in baptism records listing her parents. I then searched for her parents' name in my my database, and literally a year before she was born, they appear in the church courts because they'd had a clandestine marriage, probably because she was the mum was pregnant with Anne outside of wedlock. So it was all, very kind of fortuitous set of circumstances that made me actually be able to kind of piece together that history. But yeah, to answer your question, as I said, she'd clearly been serving him for a very long time, clearly meant a lot to him, and he recognized her service with this much higher bequest in his will. So yeah, thank you.
All right. We have a question from Adrian that says, thank you for this exciting research. In the court records you have encountered, do servants exhibit an awareness of the Atlantic colonies as an alternative opportunity, a contrasting fate, etc.?
Yeah, this is maybe this actually kind of comes fits with the question that Julie asked that I didn't answer, which was about young Black enslaved servants that you mentioned. So it's the frustrating thing about the book. I mean, and about writing the book, I'm very aware of the kind of Atlantic, excuse me, the Atlantic context, well, kind of to come, but also kind of happening in the 17th century, the period that I'm looking at as well. No is the short answer. On both kind of counts. There's nothing I can really say that kind of points towards opportunities. The kind of the service that we see people leaving to take up opportunities in the Atlantic. Didn't really end up coming up at all in a way that I had thought it potentially might, but nothing, not even a kind of trace of it. And race, just nothing obvious. I mean, I don't know. It's difficult to say, I think, about I think possibly it's a product of it being kind of rural courts. But I mean, there are urban centres too, and I'm sure it's there. It's probably just not kind of staring in the face, maybe. But yeah.
Okay. Another question, really interesting to hear more about the book. I'm interested, did you find out anything about female servants' leisure or free time from the deposition?
Yeah, some really really kind of interesting things. I mean, partly what I pointed to in the book was about the kind of links that servants had to communities rather than just within the home. But that's not to say they also weren't kind of having kind of free time or spending their free time with people within the home too. I mean, I've just talked about the excuse me, the betrothal that went wrong in Gloucester. That was a very interesting case actually, because it brought a lot of people into the home from outside who were all drinking together on this particular evening. So you could see servants being very much embedded in a culture that's sociable, but playing out within the kind of within the household in which they're serving. They do also, I mean, there's kind of a lot on kind of courtship and that kind of thing. So there are people that are I guess pushing at the boundaries of what's allowed within the home in terms of courtship, but also they make trips together, they go to markets, they go to fairs, I mean, Diana O'Hara's worked a lot on that kind of aspect of church courts. But also, I think a lot of, like, I didn't really talk about this in the book, I don't think, but a lot of kind of, I think, conversation, I get the impression, happening during work. I mean, I think, like, you know, whilst they're out in the fields working with other people, whilst they're washing clothes at the river, I mean, all these, especially I think when it takes them outside of the house, I think there is kind of this overlap of working and sort of sociability. So sometimes I think that it's not always kind of obvious in the way that I suppose, you know, today, you know, our kind of sociable and working like often overlap too. It doesn't always feel like it's obvious in the sources, but you kind of get the impression that there's more to it than just, you know, they're just doing hard at work and they, you know, that's it. I think they are having conversations that are interesting and exciting to them and part of their kind of their sociable worlds.
Right, and so we are running low on time, so maybe I will just read the last few questions and then you can take a minute to respond to what you'd like. So we have a question, congrats again. Charmian, I expect you covered this in the book, but can you say a bit about the social depth of employing a servant? What was the cutoff in terms of wealth status for families hiring a servant, and might this have implications for the servant's equal industriousness discussion? Another question, your thesis was fascinating, so looking forward to reading the book. Is there much evidence of female servants starting in a household as live-in retainers and then moving to waged and then daily workers? I see this happening in Kent with men, but no evidence with women. Someone suggested that some New England migrant families take their servants with them. A little bit of a discussion. So maybe if you want to comment on those two questions.
Yeah. So quickly about the social depth, I guess. I mean, I found servants working in the households of husbandmen, obviously a very kind of capacious term. What is a husbandman? But often people that don't appear to have huge amounts of wealth just by thinking about the you know, the wealth statements that Alexandra Shepherd looked at in hugely wealthy are employing servant. I think, I mean, I did also capture somebody who was a labourer employing a servant. I do think that I kind of have issues with these terms, husbandman and labourer in the church courts, because I think that sometimes they're being used interchangeably for reasons that I don't have time to go into right now. But yeah, and I think, yeah, you're right, that could have some implications on the industriousness ideas. The question about whether they start off as a live-in retainer and then move kind of through to more casualized, that definitely comes up for women, and it definitely comes up particularly as a woman gets older. So I have some examples of a particular example I'm thinking of, a servant in Gloucestershire, sorry, who she's described as a servant but moves to what is effectively described as char work, which, I mean, there's all sorts of questions about what the difference there is between those two categories as well, but it's quite clear she's not living in anymore. So I think that does happen. I assume that it also happens to some extent with when a woman gets married. I think possibly she still retains links with the home and still does some form of labour there. She's just no longer living in. So yes, that definitely is evident in the records I've been looking at. Was that the last question? Yes.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. We're just out of time, so I hope that everyone will join me in congratulating Charmian for the wonderful work, and then thanking Julie and Steve for their excellent comments. So thank you everyone for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you to Amanda also for sharing.
No, happy. I'm so glad we could do it. Congratulations again.
Thank you.